Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to take a whole stack of information and, well, distill it down into the key insights just for you.
That's the goal.
And today we're tackling a really big one. The fascinating, sometimes contentious relationship between competition and democracy. It's quite paradoxical, actually. We've got some material here that honestly challenges some very common assumptions.
It really does. Our sources dive right into this core tension, between what they call illegitimate private power, think big monopolies, concentrated business influence, maybe distorting public decisions,
Right.
versus illegitimate public power.
Yeah.
And that's pointing at potential overreach by democratic processes into how markets work.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. Our mission here is really to explore how these two fundamental forces interact and, what that dynamic actually means for society.
Sounds good.
So the sources seem to suggest two main ways to look at this relationship. First, there's the effect of concentrated power like monopolies on democracy itself. And second, they flip it. They look at the effect of democracy on how markets are structured and, well, the outcomes they generate.
And what's really fascinating there in that first relationship is how the sources detail the influence of business power on democratic systems.
How so?
Well, they mention concepts like the privileged position of business. Charles Lindblom talked about this. It's the idea that governments often depend so much on businesses for, jobs and tax revenue that they're inherently sort of cautious about policies businesses might not like. Then there's the rise of industrial complexes, public-private partnerships, shifting influence, and big issues like regulatory capture.
Regulatory capture, where the industry being regulated ends up heavily influencing the regulator.
Exactly. That's the idea.
So we're also talking about things like revolving doors between government and industry, intense lobbying, even the impact of decisions like Citizens United allowing more corporate political spending.
Right. These are all ways the sources suggest private power can shape, sometimes subtly, sometimes not so subtly, how democracy functions.
Okay. But then, and this is where it gets really interesting for me, what about the other side? How does democracy, maybe even too much democracy or populism, affect markets?
That's a critical question the sources raise. They suggest that, maybe excessive democracy or populist movements could lead to things like overregulation,
Okay.
potentially driving corporations offshore, creating distortions in the market, or even massive wealth redistribution that might hurt economic efficiency. They voice concerns about property rights, economic liberties being infringed upon, and they argue this could undermine the whole point of competition. They even ask, kind of provocatively, how would democracy work in a sporting event or a lottery?
Right, the democratic choice would sort of negate the whole point of the game.
Exactly.
So this naturally leads to a tough question about antitrust policy, doesn't it? Is antitrust supposed to shift market outcomes towards what's democratically preferred, like protecting smaller players? Or is it just there to protect the market structure itself, regardless of who wins or loses? The sources frame it really starkly. Is antitrust protecting the losers from the winners, or the winners from the losers?
And if you connect that to the bigger picture, the sources make a very strong, maybe even surprising argument. They basically say that competition and democracy are fundamentally not compatible.
Wow, okay. That's a bold statement. Why incompatibility?
Well, the argument presented is that competition isn't just about winning within the existing rules. It's ultimately about getting control over the rules of the game itself.
Meaning control over regulations, antitrust authority, even the state.
Precisely. And they argue that this inherent drive for control clashes fundamentally with the democratic ideal of broad shared power in setting those rules.
Okay, so if they're presented as incompatible, what's the alternative then? What do the sources suggest?
This interesting pivot. They suggest democracy is actually more compatible with cooperation.
Cooperation, not competition.
Right. So the implication is, if we really value democracy, maybe we need to think about an economic system based more on cooperation.
And really, all of this debate hinges on one absolutely crucial thing, right?
Absolutely. It all comes down to how you fundamentally define democracy itself.
Is it centralized, majority rules, making decisions for the whole economy?
Or is it more decentralized, kind of marketized, where different groups make decisions based on their own interests with less collective direction? That definition changes everything.
So what does all this mean for you, listening in? This deep dive really pushes us to think hard about the foundations of our economic and political systems.
Yeah, it really highlights that this tension isn't just about specific policies. It's about deep assumptions concerning power, control, and ultimately whose interests are served.
It definitely leaves us with a provocative thought to chew on. If competition and democracy are fundamentally at odds, as these sources suggest, then how do we actually define the rules of the game for our society? And what kind of system are we truly choosing to prioritize?
Something to mull over.
Indeed. Until our next deep dive.